Do you believe that God still speaks to us? That He gives us signs and reveals mysteries that science cannot explain? Today, you will learn about a story that can transform the way you see life and death. A real, impactful story full of profound messages about faith, purpose, and divine power. This girl died for a few minutes, and what she saw on the other side left a doctor speechless. A man of science, accustomed to seeking rational answers, was faced with something that challenged everything he believed. But before we judge this story, stop for a moment and reflect. How many times have you felt like there was something bigger around you? A warning, a whisper, an inexplicable feeling of protection? Maybe God has already spoken to you, but were you listening? The Bible tells us that in the last days God would pour out His Spirit on all flesh and sons and daughters would prophesy. Acts 2:17. What if I told you that this girl had a vision that perfectly fits this prophecy? What if what she saw was a sign of something bigger, something that God wants us to know, but that many still refuse to believe? Get ready for a story that defies human logic, a testimony so powerful that even a skeptical doctor had to admit there is something beyond this life. Are you ready for this truth? So keep watching, because what you're about to hear could change everything you think about life, death, and eternity. But before revealing the details of this experience, I want to extend a special invitation to you. If you believe that God speaks to us in ways we don't always understand, if you feel in your heart that there is something beyond this life, then this channel is for you. Here we share transformative testimonies, stories that prove that the supernatural is real and that God continues to act. So, leave your like, because this helps us get this message to more people. If you are not yet registered, sign up now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any stories that can strengthen your faith and open your eyes to the truth. Emily was a little girl of just 6 years old, full of life, curiosity, and imagination. His eyes sparkled with enthusiasm whenever he talked about his games and dreams. Coming from a loving family, she was surrounded by affection and protection, living a peaceful and happy childhood. Her parents, John and Sarah, always taught her about love, kindness, and although they were not extremely religious, they believed in something greater, in a divine force that guided their lives. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could prepare them for what they were about to face. It was an ordinary day like any other. The sun was shining outside, and Emily was running around the yard, laughing and playing like she always did. However, at nightfall, something changed. Sarah noticed that her daughter was quieter than usual. His little face, which was usually brimming with energy, was pale. "Mummy, I'm tired," she said, laying her head on her mother's lap. At first, it seemed like just ordinary tiredness, perhaps an exhausting day of playing, but soon the fever began. Nothing alarming at first, just a slight fever that could be anything. But as the hours passed, Emily's temperature began to rise rapidly. John and Sarah tried everything they could to control the fever. Medicines, cold compresses, silent prayers, but nothing seemed to have any effect. That was when Emily began to mumble disjointed words, her gaze lost as if she was seeing something beyond what human eyes could see. At this point, panic took over the parents. They knew they needed to act quickly. They took Emily in their arms and rushed to the hospital. The trip to the hospital seemed like an eternity. The desperation in Sarah's eyes mixed with John's tension, who was driving as fast as possible while looking in the rearview mirror at his daughter, trying to convince himself that everything would be okay. But Emily was getting worse by the minute. His skin burned like fire, his breathing became weaker, and then silence. For an instant that seemed infinite, her small body remained limp, unresponsive. When they arrived at the hospital, the medical team rushed to treat her. John and Sarah were forced to wait outside while doctors tried to stabilize the girl. The mother's heart felt like it was about to explode, and John, who had always been a rational man, felt something he had never felt before, a deep fear of losing his daughter. He held Sarah's hand and, without realizing it, murmured a prayer. "God, please don't take our girl. If you really exist, show us a miracle." Inside the emergency room, doctors worked quickly. Emily convulsed, and then her little heart just stopped. The heart monitor showed a straight line. Time seemed to freeze. For a few seconds, that seemed eternal. Emily was no longer there, but while doctors fought to bring her back, Emily was elsewhere. What happened in the next few minutes would defy all logic, all science, and even the faith of anyone who heard this story. Emily, just 6 years old, had a near-death experience that would change her life forever. And more than that, it would also change the life of a skeptical doctor, who that day would witness something he could never explain. Her parents, outside the room, had no idea that at that moment, Emily was no longer in this world. While doctors tried to revive her, her soul had detached from her body. But where did she go? What did you see? Who found it? What did God reveal to this little girl? Believing that there is something beyond this life opens our eyes to God's signs. This story is just the beginning, and every detail can transform your view of the spiritual world. Many people have already lived experiences that science cannot explain, proof of divine power. Share yours in the comments and write "God is real" to show that he still manifests himself today. The hospital was in chaos. Doctors and nurses ran from side to side, trying to save the life of a little girl who, minutes before, was full of energy and now lay motionless on a stretcher. Time seemed to be running against everyone inside, but for Emily's parents, outside, time simply stopped. Sarah's crying was silent, almost as if she was afraid to make noise and somehow prevent the doctors from being able to save her daughter. John paced back and forth, clenching his fists, fighting the urge to storm into the room and hold Emily in his arms. He wanted to believe that everything would be okay. I wanted to believe that the doctors had everything under control, but something inside him said that this was not a simple episode of fever. It was something bigger, something that science could not explain. Inside the emergency room, doctors worked in a hurry. Emily's body was cold, her breathing had stopped, and the machine that monitored her vitals showed a straight line. The silence that took over the room was disturbing. To the medical team, that meant only one thing: Emily was gone. But for the little girl, this was the gateway to an experience that would change everything. At the exact moment her heart stopped, Emily felt something strange. It was as if she were floating, as if a light breeze enveloped her. And suddenly the hospital, the doctors, her parents, everything began to disappear. She looked down and, to her surprise, saw her own body. There she was, lying there, while doctors desperately tried to bring her back. One of the nurses' chin was trembling. Another's eyes were wide, as if they were aware that this little girl didn't have much of a chance. But Emily wasn't afraid. There was an inexplicable peace, a feeling of lightness that made it seem like none of it mattered. She tried to call her mother, tried to touch one of the doctors on the arm, but no one saw her, no one heard her. It was then that a light began to shine in the background. It wasn't just any light. It wasn't cold or distant or scary. It was warm, welcoming, as if calling Emily close. And even without understanding what was happening, even without knowing whether she should be afraid or not, she felt her body, or whatever it was, being pulled in that direction. As Emily went up, the emergency room got smaller, the hospital got further away, and for a moment everything was completely silent. It was as if the world had stopped. And then, in the midst of that intense light, a figure appeared, a strong presence, but at the same time full of love. Emily couldn't explain it, but she felt like she'd known that figure forever. She didn't need to ask anything. Deep down, I already knew exactly who he was. Now imagine what it must have been like for Emily, a little girl of just 6 years old, with no theological knowledge, without fully understanding the meaning of words like paradise or afterlife, and yet she knew exactly where she was. But why would God choose to show this to a child? What did he want Emily to understand? What did he want the world to know through her? While all this was happening to Emily, inside the hospital, the fight to bring her back continued. The doctors refused to give up. One of them had already seen similar cases, but there was something different there. Time was passing too quickly. The chances of reversing that cardiac arrest diminished every second, but still they continued. And little did they know that at that exact moment, Emily was experiencing something that would change her life forever. It was then that everything changed. Something happened on the monitor. A split second later, a sound interrupted the silence in the room. A small, faint beat, then another, and another one. The doctors looked at each other in disbelief. She was coming back. But what they didn't know was that Emily wasn't returning alone. She carried with her a message, something that, when revealed, would make even the most skeptical doctor question everything he knew. If you're curious to know what Emily saw and what message she received, stay with me. What comes next is something you need to hear. Emily felt as if she were being carried by the wind, but without fear, without pain, without despair. It was as if she was surrounded by something greater, something that protected and guided her. From up there, I could see everything clearly. He watched her small body motionless on the hospital gurney, surrounded by doctors struggling to bring her back. He saw his mother outside the room, her face bathed in tears, holding her hands to her chest as if begging God for a miracle. His father paced back and forth, unable to accept what was happening. Time seemed to flow differently. Every detail was clearer, more real, and what was happening in the hospital was just a part of what Emily was about to experience. Suddenly, a soft sound filled everything around him. It was no ordinary sound. It was such a beautiful and comforting melody that it seemed to come from within herself, as if it were part of her essence. The light that had once been distant now grew before him, vibrant, bright, pulsing in shades of gold and white. Emily was gently pulled toward that light, feeling lighter and lighter, more and more filled with a peace she had never known. There was no more fear. There were no more doubts. Just love. As she crossed the space between the hospital room and this new reality, Emily realized she wasn't alone. Soft shadows began to form around him, silhouettes that moved with grace and lightness. They were tall beings, enveloped in an indescribable radiance, who seemed to radiate love and security. They didn't speak, but Emily understood everything they conveyed. Their presence said, "You are safe, you are loved, you need not fear." She wanted to ask where she was, but before she could even formulate the question, one of the beings approached. He knelt down to be at Emily's level, and at that moment, she felt something even stronger, an inexplicable familiarity. It wasn't fear, it wasn't strangeness. It was like meeting someone who had always been with her, even if she had never seen her before. The being smiled, and his voice sounded not through the ears, but within the girl's own soul. "Emily, you have something to do on Earth. But first I'll show you something." Those words echoed inside her with a certainty that could not be questioned. Something inside Emily knew at that moment that everything that was about to happen was important. That this wasn't a dream, it wasn't imagination. It was real, more real than anything she had ever experienced. The light around her intensified, and in the blink of an eye, Emily found herself in another place. I couldn't tell if it was a heaven, a kingdom, or a completely different world. Everything was bright and beautiful. The air seemed charged with energy, with something that made your heart beat in a different way. She looked at the floor and noticed that it reflected like polished gold, but at the same time it was soft and welcoming. In front of him, a field of flowers so vibrant they seemed alive, stretched as far as his eyes could see. The sky had colors she had never seen before, tones that did not exist in the living world. It was then that Emily realized there were people there. But they weren't like the people I knew on Earth. They glowed, radiating something pure, something that could only be described as absolute love. Some walked calmly, others seemed to be in prayer. Some laughed with genuine joy. Emily wanted to ask who they were, but before she could speak, the being that accompanied her gently touched her hand. "Emily, you were brought here to see something important, something you need to remember when you come back." She didn't understand what that meant. To go back? Where to? His childish mind tried to process everything, but it was as if only his heart fully understood. The being guided her through the fields, and then, in the distance, Emily saw a large structure. It was immense, but at the same time simple, majestic but without ostentation. Something inside her said that that place was sacred, that there lived a truth that few had the chance to know. As they got closer, Emily began to hear soft voices like a heavenly choir. But they didn't sing, they spoke, and each word went straight into your soul. They said things that Emily couldn't fully understand, but that seemed to carry deep meaning. Words like faith, purpose, time, and mission stood out among so many others that she still didn't understand. Then something happened. The structure before her glowed with an indescribable intensity, and Emily felt a presence that was greater than anything she had ever felt up to that point. She didn't see a face, but she knew she was in front of something supreme. It was as if everything in that place was alive, pulsing with divine energy. And then, a voice echoed inside her. "Emily, you need to go back." The girl felt a tightness in her chest. I didn't want to leave. The peace, the light, the love, everything there felt right. But the voice continued. "There is something you need to say, a truth that needs to be told. Emily didn't understand right away, but something inside her knew it was important. Then, in an instant, everything around him began to disappear. The light dissipated, the fields dissolved, and she felt as if she were being pulled back. Everything happened so fast that she didn't even have time to react. The last thing he heard before everything went dark was a soft whisper, "Tell them the time is near." Suddenly, Emily opened her eyes. The sound of the monitors around him filled his ears. She was back in the hospital. Her mother's face appeared above her, bathed in tears, but this time tears of relief. His father held his hand, murmuring prayers, and the doctors seemed in disbelief. Emily blinked a few times, trying to understand where she was, but inside her, something had changed. She remembered everything. Emily was taken to a sacred place, and stories like this make us see that there is something much bigger than we imagine. Many people have felt the divine presence in an inexplicable way, and each testimony strengthens the faith of those who need a sign. Write "The light is real" in the comments and share your experience, because your story could be just what someone needs to believe again. But this story is not over yet. Emily didn't just come back with memories. She came back with a message, something that would forever change the lives of anyone willing to listen. And what happened after that is something you need to know. Emily blinked a few times, trying to understand where she was. His body was still motionless on the hospital gurney, but his soul still carried the weight of what he had seen. Her chest rose and fell slowly. Her breathing returned to normal, but inside her something was different, very different. She had been faced with something that human words could never describe. She had seen the future. It all started when that voice echoed inside her. A soft, but at the same time, immensely powerful voice that didn't just speak. She felt that voice in every part of her being. Emily couldn't explain it, but every word she heard seemed to carry a spiritual weight, an urgency, something beyond the comprehension of a 6-year-old child. She was in front of something sacred, something divine, and that was unquestionable. The moment the voice told her she needed to return, she felt her body rise again, but this time it wasn't toward the comforting light. It was as if I was being taken to another space, another time. The landscape around him changed. Suddenly, Emily found herself in front of a large valley, a dark valley, different from the peaceful place he had been before. The sky, previously bright and full of indescribable colors, was now filled with dense, heavy clouds. The air was strange, charged, as if something very big was about to happen. She looked around, trying to understand where she was, when she noticed something scary. Thousands of people were there, but they weren't just there. They ran, screamed, looked for shelter, as if trying to escape something that was approaching. Emily tried to ask what was going on, but before her mouth could move, the voice spoke again. Time is running out. She didn't understand. Fulfilling what? What did it all mean? His eyes continued to scan the scene, and then in the distance, something caught his attention. There was a city that seemed about to be taken over by something gigantic. Waves of fire spread across the horizon. The ground shook, cracks formed, and, among the shadows, figures moved. But they weren't people. They were something different, something that made Emily's heart race. Huge creatures with eyes filled with darkness walked among the crowds, and wherever they passed, fear spread. This is what happens when hearts turn away from the truth. Emily flinched. The voice did not speak with anger, nor with threat. It was a voice of sadness, of regret. Something inside her felt that these people were not there by chance. It was as if they had chosen to be there, as if they had ignored something very important and were now facing the consequences of it. That's when everything changed again. The sky, which had previously been dark, began to open. A gigantic light ripped through the clouds, and Emily felt her heart fill with a feeling that could only be described as hope. From the midst of that light, a figure appeared. At first, it was just a silhouette, but as she got closer, Emily began to see the details. The face carried a love so intense that it was impossible to describe. The eyes had depth, wisdom, compassion. He didn't need to say who he was. Emily knew. His heart knew. She tried to get closer, but the figure raised its hand gently, as if to say, "Wait." And then the voice came again, but this time more clearly. "Tell the doctor he needs to believe." Emily frowned. Doctor? What doctor? What was he talking about? Before she could ask, light began to envelop her again, and everything around her began to dissolve. The city, the valley, the people, the shadows, everything disappeared, and suddenly she felt like she was falling. Not in a sudden or frightening way, but like someone being returned to their place. And it was at that moment that something unexpected happened. Emily's body, which until now had been completely still, suddenly arched onto the stretcher. His eyes snapped open, and a scream echoed throughout the emergency room. It was an intense, strong scream, full of something that no one there could explain. The doctors, who had just accepted that there was nothing more to be done, were startled and backed away for a moment. Sarah, who was outside the room, froze when she heard her daughter's voice again. Her heart stopped for a second, and then she ran inside, not caring who tried to stop her. Emily was breathing deeply, her eyes still wide, as if she was trying to understand where she was. But before she could say anything, her eyes fell on a man who was there, holding the medical equipment and watching her with a mix of shock and disbelief. He was one of the doctors who had tried to revive her. Emily didn't know him. I had never seen him before, but something inside her knew that he was the one the message was meant for. The girl stared at him, still catching her breath, and then, without hesitation, she said the words that had been echoing in her mind since she heard the voice. "Doctor, you need to believe." The entire room was silent. The man blinked a few times as if trying to understand what he had just heard. He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. The impact of those words was so great that he had to hold on to the bench next to him. How did she know? How did that girl, who until a few minutes ago was dead, know exactly what he needed to hear? What no one there knew was that that doctor had been carrying a doubt within himself for years. He had lost his faith. He had decided that he no longer believed in God, that life was just a sequence of random events with no purpose. But now here, in front of this girl who had just returned from death, everything he thought he knew was being challenged. Sarah knelt down beside her daughter, tears streaming down her face, not understanding what was happening, just grateful to have her back. John entered the room soon after, holding the door as if he needed something to hold on to. The entire hospital seemed to have come to a standstill. Everyone there knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. But Emily wasn't finished. She held her mother's hand, looked at her father, and then said something that made everyone's hearts freeze. "He showed me something. Something that will happen." What did Emily see there? What was the real message that needed to be delivered? If you believe there are divine messages that need to be heard, write "I believe" in the comments. If you have ever had a dream, a vision, or felt God speaking to you in some way, share your experience. But don't leave just yet, because what Emily revealed next was something that changed everything. The doctor remained motionless, his eyes fixed on little Emily, who was still trying to catch her breath after his return. He felt his heart beating hard in his chest, but it wasn't from the tension of the moment, nor from the effort of trying to revive her minutes before. It was because of something he couldn't explain, something that made his mind run in circles. That girl had just looked him in the eye and said exactly what he had been trying to ignore for years. "Doctor, you have to believe." He blinked a few times, swallowing hard. What did this mean? How did she know? He had never seen this child before, never spoken to his family, never demonstrated anything other than professionalism. So why did he feel as if those words were directed at him with a greater purpose? Emily, still lying on the stretcher, looked around, observing the people around her as if trying to find something. Her mother held her hand tightly, tears still streaming down her face, while her father looked at her as if he still couldn't believe what was happening. The atmosphere was still filled with shock, with disbelief. The medical team, who had already accepted that the girl would not return, now looked at her as if they were facing a true miracle. The silence was broken when Emily spoke again, but this time, her words were even more shocking. "I saw everything." Everyone in the room looked at each other. What did she mean by that? The doctor crossed his arms, still trying to process the situation, but before he could ask anything, Emily continued. "I saw you helping me. I saw the nurse trying to hold the oxygen mask. I saw the other doctor looking at his watch and saying, 'We are wasting time.' I saw the bright light flashing on the monitor and you all looking scared. I saw my mother crying outside and my father holding his head, asking, 'Why is this happening?'" Her voice was calm, but what she said made the doctors' faces lose color. How was that possible? She was unconscious the entire time. His heart had stopped. Technically, there was no explanation for her knowing what happened around her, but the doctor knew that everything she was saying was true. "That's impossible," he muttered. more to himself than to anyone else. Emily then turned her face towards him and stared at him. The girl's gaze carried a seriousness that seemed not to belong to a child of just 6 years old. It was as if she was seeing far beyond what the eyes could see. "I saw you too," she said, and the doctor felt a shiver run down his spine. He shifted uncomfortably. "Where did you see me?" Emily blinked slowly, as if choosing her words carefully. "In the hallway. You were alone." He put his hands on his face and said. She paused. The environment was so silent that it was only possible to hear the devices connected around them. "If God exists, why doesn't he give me proof?" The blood drained from the doctor's face. His mouth went dry. He took a step back. He knew exactly the moment Emily was referring to. Minutes before she woke up, he left the room feeling defeated. Frustration consumed him. He didn't believe in God. He never had. For him, medicine was the only truth. But that day, for some inexplicable reason, something inside him broke. And at the moment he felt that nothing made sense anymore. He murmured those words, almost without realizing it. Nobody listened. He was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. How? How do you know that? His voice was almost a whisper. Emily just watched him with a calm that didn't match the intensity of the moment. "He told me to tell you." He felt a weight take over his chest. Who? Who had sent it? Who was listening when he asked that question? His eyes widened slightly. His heart started to beat faster. He tried to convince himself that it was all just a coincidence, that Emily's mind was confused, that maybe she had heard something and put together that story in her head. But something inside him knew that wasn't true. Something inside him told him there was something bigger going on here. The girl looked up at the ceiling again, blinking a few times, as if her mind was still trying to process everything she had seen. "He showed me many things," she murmured, almost to herself. The doctor, still struggling to find a rational explanation, decided to do what he did best: look for answers. "What did he show you?" he asked, his voice sounding more curious than skeptical now. Emily slowly turned her head towards him. Her gaze carried something he had never seen before, something that seemed far beyond his years. "You don't want to know." The doctor's heart accelerated. "Why don't I want to know?" The little girl took a deep breath before responding. "Because if I tell you, you won't be the same." The entire room remained silent. Everyone there knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. But no one, absolutely no one, felt the weight of that conversation as much as the doctor, who was now faced with a reality he never imagined facing. If Emily really had been on the other side, if there really was someone who gave him a specific message for him, then everything he had ever believed was wrong. Everything he rejected, everything he argued against. What if he was wrong all along? He took a deep breath and ran a hand over his face. He looked around and saw the other doctors' expressions of surprise and astonishment. I knew that no one there would be able to explain what was happening, but he needed to know. He needed to hear everything. "Tell me," he said, his voice firmer now. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, as if reliving it all again. When he opened them, a single tear ran down his face. He said, "Something is coming. Emily has had a divine encounter, and some people receive messages that need to be shared. When an experience like this happens, it's not by chance. It's a call to see beyond what the eyes can see. Write 'I believe' in the comments and share your experience, because your testimony could be the answer someone needs to strengthen their faith. But this story is not over yet. What Emily saw on the other side could change everything, and you need to know what it was." The doctor remained still, speechless, unable to process everything he was hearing. He looked at Emily and felt something strange growing inside him. All his life, he trusted only in science, in what could be proven, tested, analyzed. But now, in front of that little girl, something inside him told him there was something bigger, something he had never allowed himself to consider. How could he continue to deny it after everything he had just witnessed? He tried to ignore it, tried to rationalize, tried to convince himself that maybe it was just a coincidence, a delusion caused by the trauma Emily went through. But every time he tried to push those thoughts away, her voice came back to him. "Doctor, you have to believe." It echoed like a constant reminder, an unanswered question. For the next few days, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he remembered Emily's expression when she said those words. He started researching, looking for answers. He had heard of near-death experiences before, but had always dismissed them as hallucinations of the brain, chemical responses to the dying process. But now he found himself reading articles, watching interviews, looking for accounts from people who had gone through something similar. And the more I studied, the more I realized there was a pattern. It was not possible for thousands of people around the world to have such similar descriptions. It was not possible that so many of them reported seeing beings of light, passages to another world, encounters with divine figures, and mysterious messages about the future. Something inside him began to change. He, who had previously scoffed at this kind of experience, was now completely immersed in it. But the impact of that experience was not only felt by him. Emily's family was never the same. Before, they had a lukewarm faith, something that existed but was not the center of their lives. After what happened, everything changed. Sarah, Emily's mother, began to feel God's presence in a way she had never experienced before. Before, she only prayed when she needed something, when she was desperate. But now every day was an opportunity to be grateful. She found herself crying alone, not out of sadness, but out of gratitude. Knowing that her daughter was chosen for something so big made her understand that everything in life had a purpose. John, Emily's father, who had always been a more skeptical, more rational man, struggled a little more to accept it. He tried to reason with himself, tried to find a logical explanation, but every night when he looked at his sleeping daughter, he remembered what almost happened. He remembered that, for a few minutes, she was dead. And he remembered the words that Emily constantly repeated. "Daddy," he said, "something is coming." John didn't know what to do with this information. He wanted to believe that it was just his daughter's imagination, that perhaps it was a dream or a confused memory of everything that happened. But something inside him knew it wasn't that simple. Something inside him knew that if he continued to ignore it, he would be turning a blind eye to something important. And then, without realizing it, he began to change. He started paying more attention to the details around him. Little things that previously went unnoticed now seemed like signs. He began to listen to his wife talk about faith without rolling his eyes. He began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was something more than simple earthly existence. But Emily's transformation was the most impressive of all. Since returning, she hasn't been the same. His way of speaking changed. His way of looking at people carried a maturity that didn't exist before. She began saying things that a child her age shouldn't know, phrases that carried immense spiritual depth. "Mom, did you know that love is a bridge?" Sarah looked at her without understanding. "What do you mean, dear?" "He told me that love is a bridge between worlds, that everything we do with love echoes in the sky." These words came from the heart of a 6-year-old girl. How to explain this? How can you ignore something so profound coming from someone so young? Emily's story began to spread. First, just between friends and family. Then, in the community. Soon, it reached the ears of experts. Psychologists, doctors, and students of spiritual phenomena began to become interested in the case. Some said it was a typical near-death experience. Others believed it could be something beyond that, something divine. Local newspapers reported on the girl who returned from death with a mysterious message. Radio shows began discussing what that meant. People began to wonder, are we close to something big? Is God trying to warn us about something? And then, reports from other people began to emerge. People who, like Emily, had gone through similar experiences, but never had the courage to tell them. Some said they saw the sky. Others, who saw a dark and scary place. But there was something in common among all these reports. They all came back transformed. The doctor, who had previously avoided talking about it, began to realize that there was something much bigger going on. He began giving interviews, but without giving his name. He was still afraid of what they would say about him, about his career, but something inside him knew he needed to share what he saw. And then, in one of these anonymous interviews, he said something he had never said before. "I saw a miracle." These words were repeated countless times. They were discussed, questioned, analyzed, but deep down, everyone knew that this was not just an isolated event. Something was changing. And Emily continued with her messages. He said, "The time is near." Every time she repeated this sentence, something in people's hearts tightened. What did this mean? What did Emily see? What did she know that others didn't? Getting this far means this story spoke to you in a special way. Maybe it was a chill, a deep emotion, or even a feeling that this message was exactly what I needed to hear. Nothing happens by chance. God uses signs to touch the right hearts at the right time. To continue receiving messages that strengthen your faith and transform lives, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Each story carries a purpose, and the next one might be the answer you've been waiting for. Share your story in the comments, because your testimony could strengthen someone who needs an answer. And if you don't know what to write, type, "I felt the presence of God," to show that He also believes in divine power. Leave your like so that this message reaches even more people who need to hear this story. And now something even more surprising awaits you. Click on the next video that appears on your screen and get ready, because what you're about to see could change everything.